Hey guys, and welcome back to another video. Today I want to talk about WoW lingo. So there are a bunch of different phrases or words that you might hear as you're playing World of Warcraft that maybe you don't know. And in this video, I want to go through them and talk about what they mean, when you might use them, so that you can hopefully communicate more effectively as you play World of Warcraft. So stick around and let's get into it. Okay, so this video is going to be in a couple different sections. First section, I just want to talk about some general gaming lingo that is used in World of Warcraft. So most of you should be familiar with this if you play any other video games, but maybe you don't, and maybe this is new stuff, so I'm just going to go over some generic stuff. The first two things I want to talk about are DPS and HPS. So both of these are acronyms. DPS stands for damage per second, and HPS stands for healing per second. And they're pretty straightforward, right? So damage per second is just a measure of how much damage you do on average for every second that you're in combat. You can see a DPS meter right here in the bottom right side of my screen. This is how much damage for every second of combat on average each of these players does, right? And then HPS is the same thing, but instead of doing damage, it's healing. So for every second that you're in combat, how much healing do you do, right? That's your HPS. And you can see the HPS meter over here in the bottom right corner, and that's showing how much healing on average for every second in combat those players do. So that's HPS and DPS. People will talk about them all the time, and typically if you're a damage dealer, you're going to want to do a lot of DPS, right? And if you're a healer, you're going to want to do a lot of HPS. So typically you want to make those numbers as high as possible, and that's where, you know, the fun of the game comes in. You figure out how to do that. So that's HPS and DPS. If you don't know, now you know. The next two things I want to talk about are CC and AoE. So if you've played any other PvP fighting games or anything like that, you should know what CC and AoE are, but in case you don't, first we'll go over CC. So if I just start fighting this fox right here, it's going to start attacking me, and let's say I want it to stop attacking me, right? I could use any kind of stun or fear or something, and that would be a form of CC. So I'm going to stun this guy, and now he can't hit me for 4 seconds, no matter what he does, right? So that's CC. There are two different kinds of CC. You've got what's called hard CC and soft CC. Hard CC would be something where, like that stun, no matter what the fox does, it can't hurt me at all. And then soft CC would be something like a snare that keeps the target in place, so they can keep hitting you, but they can't move, right? So CC is short for crowd control, and basically that should be pretty straightforward about like what the idea behind CC is, right? So you're fighting a bunch of stuff, and you want to control how it acts, and CC is how you do that. So like I said, you've got hard CC and soft CC, and they've got various uses, but that's what CC is. And then the other one I want to talk about is AoE. And AoE stands for Area of Effect, or some people will say attack on everything, right? Basically, if we go into my spell book, I have a spell called Shadow Crash. If I want to cast it, I get this targeting reticule on the ground. It's this green circle. And basically, instead of having a target that I use this spell on, I have to choose where I want to put it. So if there happens to be an enemy in this circle, it's going to hurt them. But if there isn't, it's not going to do anything, right? So this is a form of AoE. This is what we call targeted AoE, and specifically ground targeted AoE, because this is my targeting reticule follows the ground, right? So I'm going to be shooting it at an area, and it's going to hit on the ground, right? You also have not targeted AoE, right? So if I pull this guy and I get into combat with this guy as well, then you'll see I have this spell called Searing Nightmare that hits everything around my current target. So this is my current target, and when I press Searing Nightmare, it'll damage him and anything around him. So this Arden Moth will also get damaged. So I'm going to go ahead and do that, and you'll see I'm hitting both targets, right? So we'll use my other AoE to finish these guys off, and that's what AoE is. So you've got AoE and CC, two things that are talked about in a lot of different video games, and that's basically how they're used in World of Warcraft. So hopefully that will help you understand those. So the next thing in our list of acronyms from general gaming lingo is UI. So you might have heard of this in the past as GUI or GUI, but basically it stands for user interface if it's UI, or graphical user interface if it's GUI or GUI. And basically what that is all of these boxes, like my health, my target, all my buffs, it's all the stuff that is not part of the actual world. So if I hide the actual world, if I hide my user interface, then you see the actual world, right? And then anything that is hidden now and not hidden now is part of my UI. So these boxes, this text, all these boxes, it's basically anything that the user, or the player in this case, uses to interface with the game, right? So I have all the info I need for my spells, I have my health, all that stuff. That's my user interface. And when people talk about UI in WoW, a lot of the time they're talking about like add-ons that will alter your UI, will give you these different colored boxes and let you change a bunch of different things about it. And so your UI is important because it's how you get all your information about the game. And that's what people mean when they talk about your UI. So the next one I want to talk about is mechanics. And this one is a little bit more ambiguous because it depends on what game you're playing and things like that. In World of Warcraft specifically, though, mechanics can mean a couple of different things. So let's say you're fighting a boss, and the boss has a spell that drops all these swirlies on the ground that you have to dodge, right? That would be considered a mechanic. A mechanic is basically anything, any like game system that you have to get used to playing with in order to play the game, right? So like even moving is a mechanic. So whether I move towards my target or away from my target, all of that stuff, that's a mechanic. Like I said, swirlies that go on the ground, those are mechanics. And then you've got other mechanics like player-specific mechanics. So the order in which I press my spells, being able to press my spells without any interruptions between them is a mechanic, right? Basically, it's like I said, it's any game system that is fundamental to the game that you have to, learn to play around and get used to playing with. So the most common use of mechanics in World of Warcraft is when people are talking about this boss is going to cast this really big laser beam that you have to dodge. That's a mechanic. We need to learn how to do the mechanics of the boss fight before we can kill the boss. Because if we don't learn the mechanics, he's going to hit us with all these crazy laser beams and swirlies and stuff falling from the sky. So mechanics are a very, very base level thing that you have to understand about World of Warcraft. And that's typically how people use the phrase. Although it can mean a lot more nuanced, specific things. So, okay, and then the last thing I want to talk about for the general gaming lingo section is keybindings or keybinds. Basically what these are the buttons on your keyboard or your mouse or whatever you use to play the game that you have bound to certain abilities. So for instance, if I press escape and I go to keybindings, you can see that when I want to move forward, I press the W key, right? That's my key binding. And it's my W key is bound to move forward, right? And on my action bars, I've got my spells listed out. So my first spell right here is Mind Flay. If I press 1, I'll cast Mind Flay. And that's always going to be the case unless I change this number right here. So Keybindings are very simple, should be pretty easy to understand. It's just the keys that you press to do specific things, right? So again, it can be anything from your spells to pulling up these menus and things. Like if I press Shift P, it pulls up my mounts or my collections tab, right? There's all sorts of different key bindings. And figuring out what key bindings work for you is something that will help you get better at the game and help you have an easier time doing the stuff that you need to do when you play the game. So when you hear people talking about key bindings, they might say something like, oh, do you have that ability bound? And what they mean is, do you have a key assigned to that ability? So somebody will say, oh, I don't have Lust bound. That just means that their Bloodlust ability, or whatever they use as Lust, isn't bound to a key, which means they can't easily press it. The only way they can use it is if they press their spellbook key and they click it from their spellbook, right? So usually you want all of your stuff key bound, but that's how people are going to talk about it. And sometimes there are things you might not want key bound, but just knowing that it's an option and how it works is important to know and to understand the lingo. So, okay, so now that we're done with the general gaming lingo, I'm going to talk about some WoW specific lingo. These first two could probably fit into the general gaming lingo section because a lot of different RPG games especially use these. I'm going to be talking about classes and races. So first, let's talk about race. If you want to play as part of the Alliance, you can be any of these 7 races. And if you want to play as part of the Horde, you can be any of these 7 races. There's also these allied races that you can be. But basically what your race is whether you're an orc, or you're undead, or you're a gnome, or you're a worgen, right? So your race is like what species you are. And then, and like I said, this has some implications. Like if you want to play with the Horde, you have to be one of these Horde races, and you cannot be one of these Alliance races if you want to play with the Horde. And if you want to be on the Alliance, you have to be one of these Alliance races, right? You can't be a Horde race. So you can't be a Blood Elf and play with Alliance players. That's just the dichotomy of World of Warcraft. You've got the Alliance and the Horde, and they don't intermingle. They don't like each other. So, and then it also determines what different classes you can play, and that's the other thing I want to talk about is your class. So if you're a Blood Elf like this guy, you can be a warrior, you can be a hunter, you can be a monk, and basically these should be pretty familiar to anyone who plays any kind of RPG, right? A priest, for instance, is going to have a bunch of healing abilities, and a rogue is going to be a really stealthy guy, right? But depending on what race you choose, like if you look at the bottom here, Blood Elves can be almost everything, but they can't be a druid, and they can't be a shaman. And then if we choose a goblin can be a shaman, right? But a goblin cannot be a druid or a paladin or a demon hunter. And then a troll, for instance, can be a druid, but it can't be a demon hunter or a paladin, right? So the classes and the races kind of go hand in hand. Depending on what race you play, it limits your class choices. And then depending on what class you want to play, it limits your race choices, right? So that's what a class and a race are in World of Warcraft specifically. These are pretty important choices usually. Like your class is very, very important for how you want to play, and then your race is usually a little less important. So that's class and race. Next, I want to talk about specialization, or spec for short. If you're playing World of Warcraft and you're running around and somebody says, hey, what spec are you? What they're asking is, what specialization of your class do you play? So every class has different specializations. I'm a priest on this character, so I've got 3 different specializations that you can see here. I can either be a disciplined priest, a holy priest, or a shadow priest, right? And depending on what specialization I want to play, what spec I want to play, I'll get access to different spells, and I'll have different responsibilities and things like that, right? So my spec, so right now I'm a shadow priest. My class is priest, and my spec is shadow. So I'm a shadow priest, right? My spec is shadow, my class is priest. So that's what a specialization is. And different specializations, like I said, have different responsibilities. They have different abilities. There are some classes like Warlock and Mage that only have damage dealing specializations. So as you can see, Priest has 2 healing specializations and 1 damage specialization, right? There are classes like I said, like Warlock and Mage that only do damage. There are other classes that have tank specs as well as damage specs, like a Demon Hunter. You can be a tank or a damage dealer. And then there's at least one that has all 3. So if you're a druid, for instance, you can do any of those 3 roles. You can be a healer, you can be a damage dealer, or you can be a tank. And it just depends on what spec you want to spec into. So that's another phrase that people will say is, let's say I'm playing Shadow, but there's a fight that we need another healer on. Somebody might ask me, hey, could you spec into Disc, which means specialize as a discipline priest. And I would just, hit activate and change my specialization from Shadow to Disc to Discipline. So now I'm a Discipline priest. My spec is Discipline. My class is Priest. And these are things that you can change at will as long as you're either in a rested area or you have a tome that lets you change your talents or specialization or whatever outside of a rested area. And that's another thing that I can mention along with specs is your talents are dependent on what specialization you're playing. So as a Shadow Priest, these are the talents I get to use. I have 3 abilities that are unlocked at certain levels as I go throughout the game, and you can choose one of the 3 choices. So for this first talent row, I choose Death and Madness in this current build, let's say. And then, so you have the option to have 1 on each row, right? And these are your talents. So whenever somebody is asking, are you talented into Misery, for instance, my answer now would be no. But if I choose to take that talent, my answer would be yes, right? So some people might say, are you talented into? Are you spec'd into? That means, is your specialization whatever, or is your talent choice in that row whatever? Do you have that talent, right? So that's specializations and talents. Now I'm going to talk about a couple UI elements. So the first one is nameplate. When somebody ever mentions a nameplate or enemy nameplates, something like that, what they're talking about is this health bar that's attached to a model in the game. So if I attack this guy, he starts running at me, and you see this nameplate follows wherever the fox is, right? So now it's running towards me some more, right? This nameplate lets me know how much health this guy has. It tells me, like the debuffs on him and all that stuff. But that's what a nameplate is. So if anyone's ever talking about, maybe they can't click on a certain nameplate or something like that, somebody's nameplate is jumping around, right? That's what they mean. They mean this part of this text and this bar that follows the model of a certain entity in the game, right? And then along with that, you have the unit frame. So if I click on this unit, I get a box right here that tells me the name of it, and it shows its health, and that's the unit frame. So this is part of your UI that doesn't move usually. It's typically just anytime I want to see what my target's health is, I can look down here, and this is the unit frame. I can also click on this to select it, but typically it's going to be there because it's already selected, right? But that's what a unit frame is. So you've got other unit frames, like you have your own unit frame. So if I click on myself right here, it shows that I'm my target now. And then this unit frame is my target's target. So because I'm my own target, that means my target's target is also me, right? It's a little complicated right there. But I can also click on this and it will update. So let's say I'm targeting somebody who's targeting the boss. Then this would show them, and it would show the boss's name right here. And those are unit frames. There's also raid frames. If you're ever in a raid and you've got a bunch of people's names, those are their unit frames. Those are also, raid frames are also unit frames. And then you've got party frames, and party frames are, if you're in a group of 5 or less, you'll have their names, and you can click on them, and those are their unit frames. So it's an important distinction. Nameplates follow models of characters in game, and unit frames just sit there and you can click on them and they show you info about people, right? So that's what a nameplate is and what unit frames are. Okay, so the next two things I want to talk about are focus targets and buffs and debuffs. So if I click on this target, it pops up where my target frame is, the unit frame for my target. And then if I right click and set focus, then I have this new unit frame that pops up above my target where this specific unit will always be right here until I change my focus. So let's say I want to be fighting this guy usually, but there's another guy that I want to kick every so often, or interrupt is another way to say that. I can put this guy as my focus target, and then I can click on something else, and now let's find something that doesn't have that same name. If I click on this Verdant Prowler, you can see that my target is a Verdant Prowler, but my focus target is still this moth back here, this Placid Ardent Moth. So this lets you keep track of an enemy or a friendly ally or something if you want. But this is your focus target, and a lot of people use focus targets for specific purposes. Like if there's an ad that you know you're going to have to interrupt in 10 seconds, let's say, but you need to be doing damage to the boss, you can set the ad as your focus target and then target the boss, do a bunch of damage, and then when you need a kick, you click on this, you interrupt it, you click back on the boss, right? So that's what a focus target is. It makes it just so that you're focusing on one enemy and it's that specific unit, and anytime you need to go back to it, instead of having to find it in the world, like right now it's over here, right? Instead of having to be like, oh, where's that moth? Oh, it's right here, click on it. I can be like, I cannot even have it on my screen. Like right now, I can't see it. And I can just click on its unit frame, and now it's targeted. So if I turn around, you'll see I'm targeting this Ardent Moth now, right? So that's the focus target. And then if we can clear our focus target. So usually you right-click on the unit frame, set focus, or you right-click on the focus, and you click clear focus. That's how you set it and get rid of it. And then to talk about buffs and debuffs, these icons in the top right are things that are making my character stronger. Those are called buffs. And then there are things that make my character weaker. And the same is true for any unit in the game, right? So this Ardent Moth currently has no buffs and no debuffs. But if I put a damage over time effect on it, Shadow Word Pain, you'll see it's got this debuff on it now that tells it it's suffering 280 shadow damage every 1.5 seconds. So that's a debuff. I can also put this other debuff, Vampiric Touch, on it, and these pop up right here. I also have a debuff now, that's this Poison. I'm suffering 441 nature damage every 3 seconds. This is a debuff. This is where my debuffs pop up, and this is where my buffs are. So for things that make you stronger, or things that make your friends stronger, stuff like that, those are called buffs. And anything that makes things weaker, or does damage over time to them, or has them silenced or something, right? Those are debuffs. So that's what debuffs, buffs, and focus targets are. Okay, so the next thing I want to talk about is cooldowns, and like what on cooldown or off cooldown mean, the global cooldown. These are all different things you might hear. For a DPS class, there are different kinds of cooldowns. You'll have damage cooldowns, or you might have defensive cooldowns, or if you're a healing class, you might have a healing cooldown. Basically, what this means is it's a spell or ability that you use that has a really long cooldown afterward. That's why they're called cooldowns, right? So, for instance, I have a spell as a priest called Power Infusion. And if I use Power Infusion, if you look over here in the right where my cursor is, you can read the tooltip. If I use Power Infusion on somebody, it gives them 25% haste for 20 seconds, but then I can't use it for another 2 minutes, right? So I'll use it right now, and you'll see I get this buff that gives me a bunch of haste. If you look down here, I've got 63% haste, which is a lot. And then eventually, this buff will fall off, and I won't be able to use this spell again until 2 minutes from now, right? So that's what a cooldown is, right? It refers to the amount of time between uses of an ability, and more specifically, a cooldown is an ability that has a long cooldown, right? That's typically how it's used. It's a little weird. It doesn't make a ton of sense, right? Because technically a cooldown is just the time, but it's often used as a noun for a spell that has a long cooldown, right? So like something like my Mind Blast has a 5.7 second cooldown. You wouldn't call my Mind Blast a damage cooldown or anything like that because I can use it pretty regularly, right? I can use it every 6 seconds or so. Whereas there are other spells in the game, like Power Infusion takes 2 minutes to cool down. If you play different classes, you can have spells that take 5 minutes to cool down, or 6 minutes to cool down, or even 12 minutes to cool down, right? There are some spells that are super, super powerful, and to balance that, you can only use them once every 12 minutes or something, right? So the difference between defensive cooldowns or offensive cooldowns and things like that are basically just what does the spell do for you, right? So for instance, my major offensive cooldown as a Shadow Priest is called Void Eruption. It takes 1.5 minutes to be used again, so it's a cooldown. And when I use it, it increases all my damage by a lot, right? So Void Eruption is what's called a damage cooldown. Then you've got, like I said, defensive cooldowns, which are things like Dispersion. So Dispersion is a spell I can use that is on a 2-minute cooldown where if I use it, I reduce all the damage I take by 75% for 6 seconds. So if I'm going to get hit by a really big ability that's going to hurt really bad, maybe I'll press Dispersion so that I can survive it, right? But I can only do that once every 2 minutes, right? So usually the reason people talk about these offensive or defensive cooldowns is because they're trying to plan when you're going to use these spells that you can only use every so often, right? So if you're in a raid fight and something is coming that's going to do a ton of damage to people, and you hear the raid leader say, use personals or use your defensive cooldowns, anything like that, what they mean is use these spells that are going to give you huge defensive capabilities but are on a long cooldown. A personal is just a defensive cooldown that is only for you, right? So there are some classes or specializations in the game that have abilities that will protect a lot of people. For instance, if I play a Discipline Priest, I have this ability called Power Word Barrier, which protects everybody in a bubble, but it's on a 3-minute cooldown. That is not a personal. A personal is something that only affects you. So for me, Dispersion is a personal, Desperate Prayer is a personal, but Power Word Barrier, something that protects a lot of people, is what's known as a raid cooldown. So you would call it a raid cooldown even outside of a raid, just because it affects a large number of people. So something like Power Word Barrier or Divine Hymn as a Holy Priest, or something like Spirit Link Totem if you're a shaman, a resto shaman. And you could even call Vampiric Embrace as a Shadow Priest a raid cooldown because it heals other people that aren't just you, right? So that's what personal cooldowns, offensive, defensive, all those kinds of cooldowns are. Now, when you use an ability like this, you may hear people say, is Power Infusion off cooldown or is Power Infusion on cooldown? Because they want to know whether you can use it on them or not right now. On cooldown means that you cannot currently use the spell. It's currently cooling down. So right now, my Power Infusion is ready to be used. This is what's known as off cooldown. So my Power Infusion is currently off cooldown. I use it. Now it's on cooldown. So if somebody says, hey, PI me, use Power Infusion on me, I would say, sorry, it's on cooldown right now, I can't, right? Because there's nothing I can do to cast this spell on them. I have to wait 2 minutes before I can cast it again. And then this brings us to something called the global cooldown. And this is going to be a little harder to explain, but basically what the global cooldown is it's the amount of time that you have to wait between casting 2 spells, any 2 spells. So, for instance, if I start attacking this training dummy, you'll notice my spells, if you look down here, get a swipe that goes around them. And basically what that is, that's the global cooldown. So I use this Mind Blast, I can't use anything until the swipe goes back around. So if I'm casting stuff as quickly as possible, right, I'm pressing this button as much as I can. Every time that this bar fills up again, that's when the global cooldown has finished, right? So it's, for me, it's just a little over a second. I can only use spells every 1 second that I'm fighting, right? Around that often. And that's the global cooldown. So there are certain spells that are on the global cooldown, which means you can only use them after every global cooldown, or a GCD is how you might also hear that described. But then there are other things that you can do whenever you want. So those are things that are off the global cooldown. So for instance, as a Shadow Priest, Power Infusion is off the global cooldown. Fade is off the global cooldown. So let's say I'm fighting and I want to reduce my threat. I can just press, if you watch the cooldown swipe, I'll use it with Desperate Prayer right here. It's going to be a little hard to see. But if you watch this cooldown swipe, I'm going to press this button while the cooldown swipe is going, and it will still go off. So I'm going to do this Mind Blast, and then right after this Mind Blast, I'm going to cast this Desperate Prayer. And you'll notice, oh, I did it badly right there, but you'll notice that, I'll do it with Power Infusion right here. You can cast stuff during the global cooldown, but it's only certain abilities, and those are called off the global cooldown. So it's important to know what is on the global cooldown and what's off the global cooldown, because there are times where you need to use an ability right now. You don't have enough time to wait for the global cooldown to come back up, and that's called being GCD locked, which is a bit more in depth. But you can use off global cooldown abilities whenever you want. So that's what the global cooldown is. What on cooldown, off cooldown, pretty much everything about cooldowns. There you go. Next, I want to talk about procs and macros. So you might hear the term proc. If somebody's talking, they say, oh man, I got a lot of procs this pull. That's awesome. Basically what they're saying is there are certain spells or abilities in World of Warcraft where there's a chance that you get, like for instance, if I press P, I go into my my spell book and I go over Dark Thoughts. So if you read this tooltip, for each of my shadow damage over time effects on the target, my Mind Flay and Mind Seer have a 3% chance to trigger a Dark Thought. This is what's called a proc, right? So if I have 2 damage over time effects, so Vampiric Touch and Shadow Word Pain on this target, now every time I cast Mind Flay, every time it ticks, I have a 6% chance to get a Dark Thought, which is this thing, which is where I can instantly use a Mind Blast. So a proc is just something that there's a chance that it happens, and when it does happen, it procced. And when it doesn't happen, you didn't get a proc, right? So right there, I got a Dark Thoughts proc. So I use it, it's gone. I'm going to keep casting Mind Flay to keep waiting for another one. I'll add another damage over time effect so that's a higher percent. There's another one, I use it, right? So that's what a proc is. It's something that has a chance to happen, but not always, right? And procs have various different effects, right? Some people really want a lot of procs. For Shadow Priest, there are times where you don't want to get procs, and so you try to play around it or whatever. There's another one that I just used. So that's what procs are. You can get procs from passive things like having dots on this target. there are times where if you're playing like a Resto Druid, you can get like clear casting procs is what they're called, where your healing over time effects have a chance to make your next regrowth cost no mana, and that's just passive from you just having healing over time effects on things. But then there are also things that you have to be doing stuff to get the proc, right? And that's like these Dark Thoughts procs. If I have to be casting Mind Flayer or Mind Seer to get this Dark Thoughts proc. I just got one, so I use it, right? So that's what procs are. And then I want to talk about macros. If you type /macro in chat, you'll see this macro pane that lets you, enter in these different macros. Macros are basically, they're basically things that you would type in chat, but you use a button to press it, and it'll type it in chat for you anyway, right? So if we look at my dispersion macro, for instance, when I want to cast dispersion, I also want to be able to cancel it whenever I want, and I want it to add this cool rainbow effect behind me, right? So if I press dispersion right now, you'll see this rainbow that's going behind me. That's because I have this macro. So I have there's a toy called Prismatic Bauble that will give you that rainbow. That's this thing. If I wanted to have that rainbow behind me every time I press dispersion and I didn't have this macro, I would have to click dispersion, and then I would have to click Prismatic Bauble, and then I would have it, right? But instead, I can just press the one button because I macroed them together. So if I were to type out these things in chat, if I were to type /use space no stealth space Prismatic Bauble, it would be like I clicked this. And then if I were to type /cast dispersion, it would cast dispersion. But instead, I have it on a button. I just press it one time and it casts it, right? And I also have this cancel aura so that if I want to cancel my dispersion, right, I could just press it again. Macros can be used for a lot of things, although they've been limited in a lot of ways since World of Warcraft first introduced them. They don't want you to make one button macros where you press one button and it does every spell that you would ever want to do, and it does it perfectly and all that, right? So there are some limitations, but macros can get really complicated really quickly. So if you're interested in like how to make good, helpful macros that are going to help you out a lot, there are videos out there where people talk about, the different modifiers and things that you can add to your macros. But yeah, typically it's just like you want to make sure you cast this trinket every time you press this button, so you macro them together, right? Or maybe you have a macro that will kick your focus target. It'll interrupt your focus target whenever you press this button. That way you don't have to click on the focus target's nameplate. So like if I set my focus right here, if I wanted to kick this guy right now, I would have to click on this and then kick it. But you could make a macro where it just kicks your focus target, or you put your mouse over your focus target, and instead of having to click, it just kicks it, and you can stay targeted on this guy, right? So there are different ways that you can use macros and things, but that's what people mean when they talk about macros. So I'm not going to go more in depth about how to use macros, but that's what they are. So the last things that I want to talk about in this lower level part of the WoW specific lingo is trash and ads, right? So they're pretty similar. Let's say you have a boss fight where the boss will summon additional enemies that you have to kill during the fight, right? That's what you would call ads, right? It's short for additional enemies, right? So if I open up the adventure guide and I go to the raids, Castle Nathria, on Sun King's Salvation, you'll see that there's Kael'thas, which is the boss, and there's the Shade of Kael'thas, this is the boss, right? But then there's also like all these guys, right? The Soul Infuser guy, Pestering Fiend, all these things. And as the fight progresses, these guys come out and start fighting you as well, right? These are ads. So they're not the boss. You do need to kill them, but they're additional enemies that come while you're fighting the boss. They call those ads, right? And then in a similar sense, trash is what the word we use to refer to enemies that aren't bosses. And it can mean in a raid or in Mythic Plus or whatever, but it just means any enemy that isn't a specifically designed encounter that has like lower implications and all this stuff. Trash is usually just like, oh, there's 10 foxes you gotta kill. That's trash, right? Or, oh, there's a pack of non-elite enemies outside the boss room, but the only way to get into the boss room is to kill them. That's a trash pack, is what you would call that. So if you ever hear people talk about ads or trash, that's the difference. Ads are typically not there until during the fight, right? And they're part of a boss encounter. And trash is stuff that is not part of a boss encounter. That's also not a boss. So ads, part of a boss encounter, not a boss. And trash, not part of a boss encounter, also not a boss. So that's the difference. You'll usually see a lot of trash in Mythic Plus or in dungeons, right? But there's also a bunch of trash in raids. It's just typically like filler for you to kill as you go between bosses, right? So that's ads and trash. Okay, now we're to the higher level WoW lingo section. So a lot of players won't ever hear these upcoming terms and phrases just because the way they play the game isn't competitive enough for the need to have these lingos, or this lingo, I guess. So I'm not going to spend as much time, like explaining everything at a very, very basic level. These are like higher level concepts, so I'm just going to explain what they are, right? But I'm going to assume that you know how to play the game. This isn't your first time ever hearing stuff like this, and I'm just going to explain them like that. So the first one I want to talk about is comp or composition. If you're in a raid or if you're doing Mythic Plus, that's typically where you'll hear these. Also in like arena and PvP, you would have a different team comp or composition, right? It basically just means what classes and specs are you bringing to the content, right? So in a raid, your composition would be like, are you stacking a bunch of warlocks? Are you bringing 3 or 4 death knights, right? That would be a different team composition than if you were playing a bunch of priests or you had 7 healers, right? So your team comp, like I said, is what classes and specs are you bringing or in the group for you to do whatever content you're doing, right? And different team compositions have different strengths and weaknesses and are better suited for certain things and worse off for other things, right? So for instance, like the meta comps for Mythic Plus are typically like you want a strong tank that can do a lot of damage. You want a healer that can do a lot of damage. Right now it's like Holy Paladin usually. And then you almost always want a mage, right? Because they bring lust and they do a ton of damage. And that's like your main comp, right? So if you were to create a team composition that had, like, let's say, instead of a mage, you brought an Ellie Shaman, right? That would be a different team comp, and that would be a comp decision. So that's what comp means. And the like nuances and stuff to it are kind of like something that you just have to like run into the situation where you need to talk about that stuff to understand, right? But like I was saying, for the majority of players, your composition does not matter. You can still do almost all the content with any composition. But if you're trying to like push rankings in raid, or you're trying to get really, really high Mythic Plus dungeons done in time or whatever, then and you have the luxury of being able to play different classes or specs whenever you want, then your composition is something that you might want to look into as another avenue of making yourself or your group stronger, right? So that's what composition is. Next, I'm going to talk about the spell queue window and spell queuing. I'm not going to go way too in depth because Jeeth from Echo has a really good video where he talks about the spell queue window. I'll link that in the description below. You should check it out. He's a world first raider, so he knows more than I do, obviously. I'm just some guy, right? But the spell queue window is basically a character-specific variable that the game keeps track of that is the amount of time before the end of your current cast where you can press a spell and it will queue it to be cast immediately after the current cast ends. So let's say I have a Mind Blast, and my Mind Blast right now is a 1.2 second cast, but let's say it's a 1 second cast. If my spell queue window is 200, it's in milliseconds. So let's say my spell queue window is 200. That means that when I press Mind Blast and I start casting it, for the first 800 milliseconds, regardless of what other buttons I push, as long as I don't like move or break the spell or whatever, any other spell that I try to cast won't be cast and it won't be queued up. But then for the last 200ths of a second, the last 200 milliseconds of my cast, if I press a different spell, it'll be put in the queue to cast immediately after this one finishes, right? And this is super, super important when you're trying to optimize things, because you want to be casting as many spells as possible, as quickly as possible, right? To do as much damage as possible. So it's important to get your spell queue window to a place where you can reliably have zero downtime between spells, right? And like I said, I'm not going to go too much into detail about how to find that number for yourself. I'll just say that mine right now is at 150, but you should watch that Jeeth video that I talked about, that I'm going to leave a link to in the description, if you want to know more about the spell queue window and how to queue your spells. And that's what spell queuing is, right? Spell queuing is where you press an ability and it doesn't fire immediately. It fires as soon as the one you're currently casting ends, right? So if you want to queue up a spell, right, you press it during your spell queue window, and then it's spell queued, right? And then it'll go off as soon as that spell is done, right? So that's the spell queue window, and spell queuing, again, very important. Go watch that Jeeth video. I talked about raid CDs a little bit before when I was talking about cooldowns, so I'm not going to mention it too much here, but I put it in my notes in this higher level portion because raid CDs are something that are very, very important to get right, and they have a huge amount of power in determining whether you successfully do what you're trying to do or you fail. So raid CDs, as a concept, I don't think are very difficult and probably shouldn't be at this part of the video, but they're in my notes, so I'm going to mention them now. Raid CDs are something that you want to make sure, and there are very many raid CDs that people don't necessarily talk about all the time. Like I mentioned, Vampiric Embrace is technically a raid CD. Same with like Life Grip, Leap of Faith is technically a raid CD, because if there is ever a moment where somebody needs to be gripped and it's life or death, whether you finish the pull or you wipe, right, then Leap of Faith should be assigned and scheduled to be used at that time, right? And it's a raid CD because it affects the whole raid. Same with Vampiric Embrace. And there are obvious ones like Spirit Link Totem, like I mentioned, Power Word Barrier, things that people talk about all the time when they talk about raid CDs, but then there are less obvious ones, like I just mentioned, Vampiric Embrace, Leap of Faith. I'm sure there are others on other classes that I'm less familiar with, so that's raid CDs. Next, I want to talk a little bit about DPS checks and healing checks. So Sludge Fist is a really good example of this, and Kael'thas Sunstrider, Sun King Salvation in the raid. These are two good examples. A DPS check is basically when you have to do, let's say, 5 million damage in 5 minutes, right? And if you don't do that much damage in that much time, you fail the DPS check. So the DPS check is basically just saying, can you do this much DPS? And if the answer is yes, you pass. If the answer is no, you fail, right? So like I was saying, let's say the boss has a 5-minute enrage timer, like Sludge Fist is pretty close to that, and you have to do, let's say, 5 million damage. If you can't do that in that much time, you fail the DPS check. And a healing check is pretty much the same thing, but with healing, right? You have to be able to heal, like on Kael'thas, on Sun King Salvation, there's a moment where the boss will put a healing shield on himself, or it gets put on him or whatever. And if you don't heal him and enough to break the healing absorb shield, you all die, right? That is a healing check. And that's a DPS checks and healing checks can be very specific like that, where it's very obvious that you have to do this much damage in this much time or you die. Or they can be less obvious and more nuanced, like maybe if you do this much damage by this time, you skip this mechanic, and if you don't do that much damage in this amount of time, you get that mechanic, and then it changes how the fight's going to go and it makes it harder or easier, right? So there are like hard DPS checks and hard healing checks where you instantly wipe if you don't make them, and then there are like softer ones where you're not going to wipe, but it's going to be harder. And then there's a lot of nuance to DPS checks and healing checks and how they actually affect how you play the game. So that's what those are. And then the next two I want to talk about are stutter stepping and positioning. Stutter stepping is something that I first found out about when I started playing Shadow Priest, because there are, as a caster especially, if you play a melee character, you're never going to have this problem unless you have to like hard cast something, which I don't know of any melee classes that do that. But as a caster, you want to spend as much time as possible casting, right? Because when you cast, you do damage. So you want to be doing as much damage as possible, or as a healer, you do healing when you cast, right? So you want to spend as much time as you can healing or casting. And so stutter stepping is where you move in between casts. So right now, I'll show you a good example. Every time I cast an ability, my global cooldown is going to start. And when my global cooldown goes, that's when I got to be... when my global cooldown is going, that means I can't cast, right? So I have to move, right? So for example, I'll just use some instant casts because it makes it easier. If I just press Shadow Word Pain a bunch, then I can move wherever I want as I'm casting, right? But if let's say I press Shadow Word Pain and then I need to stop and cast, and then I press another one, and then I can move, and then I need to stop and cast, right? This is basically what stutter stepping is. It's just moving while your global cooldown's going on, right? And it's super important the higher up you go, because the DPS checks and the healing checks become more tight and harder to make. And so if you optimize your positioning like this by stutter stepping and by moving when you're moving between casts and stuff like that, your positioning can be good. Like you can get to the mechanics you need to get to in time and stuff like that, and you could still keep a high amount of DPS. So that's why you stutter step, and that's what stutter stepping is. If anyone ever mentions stutter stepping to you, it's basically that. It means moving during your downtime when you can't be casting anyway, right? And then that brings up positioning a little bit. Positioning is something that's more important than people give it credit for, I think. Positioning as a concept is basically just where you're standing in relation to where you need to be or where you will need to be in the future, stuff like that, right? So let's say I know that there's going to be a soak at this position. I'll put down a marker. Oh, I can't put down a marker because I'm not in a party. But let's say there's going to be a soak at this position in 5 seconds. If I just stand here for those 5 seconds and cast, then I'm really out of position, right? Because then 5 seconds passes, the soak goes, and I have to go, oh crap, and run over there, and now I'm not casting, and then I barely make it in time, right? Whereas if I use stutter stepping, I can be like, oh, in 5 seconds I need to be here, so I'm going to cast this, I'm going to cast this, I'm going to move, I'm going to start casting, I'm going to move a little bit more, I'm going to cast this, and then I'm there, right? So positioning as a concept, it could be group positioning or your own personal positioning. It's just where you are in relation to, like I said, where you need to be, where you will need to be, all that stuff. And then the last thing I want to talk about to wrap up this video is something that's not super clear. It's value. So you'll hear people talk about value a lot. They'll be like, wow, I really got full value out of my cooldown window right there. That's great. Or wow, I didn't get much value out of that Devouring Plague right there. And basically what value is hard. It's a little hard to explain, but it's like a relative value of how good something is compared to how good other things would be in that situation. So for instance, to get good value out of your cooldown windows, basically what you want to do is as much damage as possible in that cooldown window, right? So let's say I pop Power Infusion, I pop Void Form, I'm doing damage, and then 3 seconds after I pop those, everything dies, and I can't do damage anymore for the next 10 seconds, even though my big damage dealing cooldowns are running, right? That would be very little value out of my cooldown windows. But let's say I pop all my cooldowns and stuff lives through the whole window, and then it dies at the very end. That's a lot of value. I'm getting a lot of value out of my cooldown windows in that case. Then you got things like, let's say you have abilities that are target capped to 5 targets. Those have a lot of value up until you get to 5 targets. And then once you pass 5 targets, they start to lose value because they're not doing damage to all targets, right? So, for instance, Mindbender with Shadowflame Prism, the Shadow Priest legendary, it hits 5 targets, and it teleports behind and hits 5 nearby targets, right? So, if I were to use this on a 5-pack, a pack of 5 enemies, I'd get pretty good value, right? This is probably my strongest single target or 5 target thing to be doing is pop Mindbender and get a bunch of Shadowflame Rifts. But then if I go up to 6 targets, my Shadowflame Rifts are only going to be hitting 5 of the 6 targets, which is not 100%, right? It's 5/6 of the targets. And then if I add another target, it's 5/7 of the targets. And obviously, like, let's say I get to 20 targets, I'm only hitting 5, right? Even though there's 20 there. So that spell or that ability is going to be less valuable than something that hits all 20 targets, like Searing Nightmare, for instance, right? So value, you'll hear people talk about value a lot, and it's really nuanced, and it's not super easy to explain, and it's not super easy to understand at face value. But if you think of it kind of as like mathematically determining what's best in a given situation, that's really what value is. It's like a graph of how good something is over time with different target amounts, with different levels of insanity or resource gen or whatever. All that stuff goes into value, right? And the reason people talk about value is because they want to express what spell is best to use at a certain time, or how good of a use you got out of a certain spell, right? It's just a metric to see how well things are going. So that's all of the high level stuff. I'm sure I missed some stuff. If you made it to the end of this video, then feel free to leave a thumbs up or a thumbs down if you didn't like it, I guess. But thank you for watching. Definitely let me know what you guys think in the comments below. Like I said, I'm sure I missed some stuff. Maybe I explained some stuff poorly. That would not surprise me. If there's anything you have questions about or anything, let me know. Also, I have a Discord server. There's a link in the description. Feel free to join, and I can give you more personalized feedback or whatever. It's a good way to get a hold of me. Anyway, that's it for this video. I'll see you guys in the next one. Peace.